please welcome Omar to the lecture.
Thanks. I'm going to be talking about import maps and HTTP imports and how you could use them in the browser and beyond today. And this is a very common error, which I'm sure you're familiar with when you're trying to use ESM in the JavaScript world over the past few years. And it's not so scary. We've been using Dino import maps, HTTP imports in production for the past 2 years now, and I'll walk you through some of those examples. First, a little about me. My name is Omar Mashaal. I run a company called Exhibitionist Digital, which works with festivals, museums, and art galleries around Australia. So we work with Rising a lot and Dark Mofo, if anyone's familiar, festivals in Hobart and Melbourne. We're doing more work in Sydney now because I'm a Newcastle resident now, so moved to Newcastle about a year ago. So yeah, we do a lot of digital work, web work, ticketing for festivals, really insane motion tracking as well. So like this is something we did at Acme that was like motion track bodysuit with this crazy 3D world. So we do like the digital web aspect as well as like help with the physical stuff. And a bit of a segue into this talk is at the start of the lockdowns in Melbourne, I was living there and I was locked in a little room. So I was obsessed with Deno at the time. And is anyone here familiar with Deno or use it at all? A handful of people. Yeah, cool. So they're kind of focused around web standard APIs, and they don't support SydJS. They sort of have to now, which is very confusing. But when they first came out and they were like really hot out of the gates, they were no SydJS, all ESM. Import maps were supported, like a first-class feature, which is the only runtime which actually does that at the moment. Oops. So what is an import map? We touched on that quickly on the last talk, but basically it's a JSON file that you could put in your HTML that sort of maps bare specifiers to HTTP imports or a local path on in your source code. So here's a quick example. ESM.sh is one of the few ESM CDNs which allow you to use NPM modules that may or may not be written in ESM, but they kind of have a build process that lets them be able to be used as ESM. And they're sort of, ESM.sh is an amazing CDN that was built by someone who was on the Deno core team for a short while, but now he's just maintaining ESM.sh as well as doing some other work as well. But it's a really notable one because it actually works with TypeScript out of the box. It sends TypeScript headers to your local running environment, and you get types as long as with ESM for any NPM module, whether it supports SydJS or not. So a quick little difference between how you do it in Node versus something like Deno or just import maps in the browser is Node has their own kind of module resolution system, and import maps kind of just go to a URL, and they're easy to hot swap if you kind of get into like using different CDNs for different reasons. And I don't know if anyone's seen this, but this is something that Ryan Dahl, who was one of the founders of Node, who is now the founder of Deno, and he did this talk about regrets he had about Node. And this was all about regretting package.json because it kind of locked everyone into the NPM community. And and actually extensionless imports, which you've touched on briefly, which actually adds so much more confusion because of all those different types of extensions and whatnot. And as well as index.js. So Deno hasn't been that great because they have something called mod.ts, which if anyone knows that, that's sort of like an index.js, but with a different name, which it's basically just one file that imports everything in the repo or the project. So when you actually import a mod.ts file, you're actually like importing everything that's exported out of that file, which is not great. There's a whole bunch of chats in the Deno thread about why we shouldn't be doing this, because it just adds useless imports that you may or not be using at all. And the sort of care around that aspect is it's not like a hill that anyone really wants to die on. So it kind of just gets worse and worse and worse. Um, yeah, so why is this cool at the end of the day? So we've been enjoying it because we could write and ship applications with modern JS. The same JavaScript that you write in your Deno environment, you could ship straight to your browser environment, and the import maps work exactly the same on the server and in the client. And you can achieve some really far out, like dynamically loading client-side rendering, server-side rendering applications without having to do all this weird bundling and stuff. And again, your tooling and build chain can be heavily reduced. The Node ecosystem is sort of doubling, tripling down on more and more complicated features and stuff that probably shouldn't exist and won't ever work in the browser. So I don't know. There's not a lot of there's a bit of a gap between something that's browser standard and something that's sort of Node server standard, and um, is it's a hard issue, and it really is just a community thing at the end of the day. Um, no bundling is required. I'll show you some examples of that. And one of the neat features is that dependencies with ESM can be loaded dynamically. So if you have an import map with 20 imports and you're only using 3 of them on a certain route or file, it'll only use those imports. And when you go to the next route that may use more, they'll be dynamically loaded um, when it's time for that. And some people kind of view that as a performance issue, but I actually think it's pretty neat that you can kind of code split your code natively without having to use some weird bundler that kind of does all this stuff for you. And this is a simple example of how you could use import maps in a plain HTML file. So you could actually whack this code straight into an HTML and run it in your browser, and it'll all just work. Micromark is a library that kind of is a small markdown parsing library. So you can see in this example, it'll actually just take that bit of code and convert it into HTML for you. Scopes are another feature of import maps. So this is something where if you wanted to swap out a different version of a different module that may be shared at some other part of your tree, you could actually define unique scopes between different paths, different routes, and it will use a different ESM module for that component. I don't use these heaps because they do add a lot of confusion to something that is already a little bit confusing for people. So scopes are just something that's in the spec for import maps, but to be determined on how it actually pans out. Yeah, so this is a quick example of, you may have seen this if you use a lot of different front-end frameworks. They'll automatically run it through some sort of code splitting bundle. So you'll have like a common bundle followed by like video player bundle versus like UI navigation bundle. And they try to do a really smart job of splitting that up. But with something like ESM and import maps in the browser, some tools like React, for instance, will actually let you lazy load components. So say you have a router that's sort of built around lazy imports, they'll only be called when that route is hit. So you kind of have dynamically loading modules as well as all of their dependencies natively code split in browser, and that can work both with server-side rendering and client-side rendering. And I think that's a really neat feature because that's one of the big selling features of a lot of these frameworks that require really complicated bundles. And as Ring has said, this is all fully supported in all major browsers at the moment. So I think as of 2 months ago, Safari was the last one to kind of get the green light, and you can use it without any polyfills or anything today, which is quite amazing. And in the runtime support, as I said, Deno is fully supported from day one to support this. Node, I think, is on its way to supporting it, but there is a third-party loader, but I have not tried it myself. And if anyone's been following Bun, he seems pretty anti-supporting this ever. So I think he'll get there, but that project is a bit of a, I don't know, it's not sure how usable it is, I guess. And again, besides all the cons about confusion and how packages are written and kind of published, The tooling for import maps is still in its early days. So if you're using a Deno project or even a browser-based import map project, you're going to be manually modifying these JSON files where, if you're used to the Node world, you just add a file, it adds it to your package JSON automatically. There's some tools that sort of try to do this, but they're all very early days, and you're not going to get that same level of years and years of experience and usability with the Node world. And much of the NPM ecosystem hasn't been migrated to ESM yet, which we touched on earlier. Some of the cool things that allow you to use this now are these ESM CDNs, and two of the most popular ones are ESM.sh and JSPM.io. And here's a quick run through of sort of ESM.sh, which was written by one of the core Deno team members. And it has a whole bunch of options around how you could get around some of the NPM modules that aren't supporting in this sort of world. But everything from specifying subdependencies, aliasing dependencies, tree shaking libs that weren't built to be tree shook. And it's basically like a surgical tool for working with ESM in today's kind of interim world where we're sort of half SydJS, half ESM. And the other one is JSPM, which is written by a developer named Guy Bedford, who's been really a huge proponent for import maps in general. And he has a tool here where you could actually just make your own sort of package JSON-like sort of listing of dependencies here, and then kind of it'll output your specific import map that you could just use in browser or Deno if you wanted. The cool thing with ESM.sh is it actually sends TypeScript headers, so you get TypeScript support out of the box. JSPM doesn't do that, as far as I know, and to this day. And some of the kind of, the tooling that exists in the Node world is really all around managing SydJS and ESM and trying to make that a smoother experience. I think there are some really exciting build tools in the Deno world and the ESM world that you're not thinking about SydJS at all. You're pretty much going to optimizing ESM and optimizing import maps. And a common thing that a lot of developers have a complaint with the ESM CDNs is you don't want to go to production with an ESM CDN. If your project relies on React, for example, you don't want ESM.sh going down and being a liability. So there's tools like Mesozoic, which will actually take those ESM CDNs and kind of make local versions of them. And ESM.sh now even has its own local version, so you could actually run all that stuff locally, build your ESM imports, and use them however you want. And again, Cindersaurus does come up again, because he did convert most of his packages to ESM. And this is a gist link, which is actually still up. But I don't know if anyone's seen this, but this was sort of his reasoning about why he's doing this change. And it goes pretty in depth about what all the pitfalls are and why it's important. And eventually he's just going full ESM. And I do think that eventually the majority of the really popular libraries that you're going to be are going to be using all ESM. Eventually, it's just about pulling that plug, which should have been done years ago. I was one of the first early adopters of experimental modules in Node, and it just took so long. I was there. It was 2017, I think, when they put that in experimental, and it's 2023, and it's still a mess. So I don't know. Anyway, really good read here. And this was a massive, there were thousands and thousands of comments. These are all comments of people arguing about why this is a thing. And he actually went in and locked it and started deleting everything. And yeah, it's absolute drama. Another one, a developer named Worm, who's really great. He works on MDX and does a lot of really cool Markdown libraries. He's kind of been focusing on making all of his packages work with npm, with deno, with browsers, and it's great that you go to his repos and they all have a really clear, like, how do I use it in this language, in this environment, whatever. And I do think that this is like kind of a standard that we should be trying to achieve, at least in the near future, before everything is ESM. Cool. So there are some modern frameworks which support import maps today. And probably the biggest one, which will probably get me banned from this talk, is Ruby on Rails. But this is in their latest version, version 7, which I think came out around early 2022. And they changed their entire front-end tooling in Rails to support import maps, which is like really awesome. They were one of the only first major framework to do this. And DHH is kind of a controversial character, but he has a lot of great blog posts around why he moved to import maps and why Rails went that way. And they make that emo service, which is actually using all import maps at the moment. So a really great kind of slightly scary future where Rails is still pushing front end forward in a weird way when JavaScript is kind of falling behind. Browsers run more modern JavaScript than Node does, which is shocking. Sorry. And this is one that we made at work that we've been using for some of our projects, for some of our art clients. And it was meant to be a way to use React server-side rendering, client-side routing with really, really simple. The only dependencies you need are React DOM, and the Ultra library, which is the name of the repo. And this allows you to use React, server-side rendering, client-side routing, suspense, lazy dynamic imports, all of the kind of new features besides the server components, which we haven't had a chance to look at yet because there's no documentation. But yeah, it's a way to make really lightweight React apps that are fully ESM, not a single bit of code that's SydJS. But the caveat is React itself is still not an ESM package. And I think I have oh no, this is something. Oh yeah, so here we go. This is a React issue from 2017 when this stuff was starting to be more talked about. And it's all about adding ES 2015 versions of exports, which means you wouldn't need to use something like ESM.sh. But again, this is 5-6 years old. And I'll just bring like the last one, which was last year, I guess, at this point. So, hybrid CJS and ESM packages are too much of a hassle. Dual package hazards break React, etc. It's time to let CommonJS die and I'll go ESM. Again, just a controversial note to end on, but until we kind of find a way to support ESM more wholeheartedly, we're going to be running into issues like this. And I find the front end space to be actually the most tricky to handle because front end dependencies are so absurdly complex at the moment when they don't follow browser conventions at all. We have weird file extensions and non-standard templating languages, and even TypeScript itself is kind of an odd one. There is native types being proposed to be put into JavaScript, which I think, I do think it's been so hard to get to the state where it is now. It actually is usable, but it's still a heap of work to do. So yeah, it's a very interesting problem because in some ways, JavaScript is better than it ever has been if you're using JavaScript in the browser with some of the new features that the browser allows you to use. But it's really the ecosystem around Node that's like a bit toxic to that kind of end goal. And Deno itself was a really exciting contender there, but even there, they're kind of floundering a bit at the moment. So we're going to have to find a solution that kind of has everyone happy at the end of the day. And yeah, I guess that's it for me. So yeah, I work at a company called Exhibitionist. If anyone is interested in actually like trying to push import maps forward and actually want to use them in production, yeah, give me a shout out, because we have a small little crew who work on this stuff. And yeah, thanks for your time.